Madam President.
Majority Whip is recognized.
Madam President, when the Constitution was written, there were some fundamental principles which were included, and one of them said that any declaration of war in the United States had to have the approval of the American people through their elected representatives in Congress. It was an awesome responsibility, an important one. I think it was the right responsibility given to the people through their elected representatives. After World War II, there were several engagements by the American military without such a declaration of war. Those were, of course, controversial and debated, but I'm sure you recall, and I do too, October of the year 2002, when this Senate was called on with the House of Representatives to consider the invasion of Iraq and the authorization of use of military force for that purpose. We may have forgotten by now, 20 years later, but I remember very vividly the fearsome national debate over whether this nation, having been hit on 9/11, needed to invade Iraq. The rationale was weapons of mass destruction were present in Iraq, threatening not only nations in the Middle East, which were our friends and allies, but even threatening the United States of America. That threat of weapons of mass destruction was beaten into our heads day after day. But many of us were skeptical, and the vote came on the floor of the Senate, I recall, in October of 2002. It happened late at night, and at the end of the day, there were 23 of us, 1 Republican and 22 Democrats, who voted against that authorization for the use of military force in Iraq. I look back on it, as I'm sure others do, as one of the most important votes that I ever cast. It was not only a decision about going to war, but it was a false argument that weapons of mass destruction were threatening anyone. After invading and after making the commitment of American military force along with our allies, no weapons of mass destruction were ever found in Iraq. It was a lie perpetrated by those who wanted to drag the United States into the Middle East for a long-term commitment and a dubious threat to our country. The repeal of this authorization of use of military force does not mean that the United States has become a pacifist nation. It means that the United States is going to be a constitutional nation, and the premise of our founding fathers will be respected. If there is cause for us to use military force in the future, we should properly follow that Constitution and let the American people have their own voice in this process through their elected representatives in Congress. I am a co-sponsor and fully support the removal of this authorization of use of military force and believe it's consistent with the vote many of us cast in 2002 against that premise. Madam President, on a separate issue, Americans woke up with a bad case of deja vu last week. We witnessed the biggest bank collapse since 2008. This time, thankfully, President Biden and federal regulators stepped in swiftly to minimize the damage caused by the failure of Silicon Valley Bank. Their actions help protect the financial security of Americans across the country, including small business owners in my own home state who banked at SVB and needed to make payroll. But there's an important lesson here. It's the same lesson we learned after the Great Recession and even the Great Depression before it. The financial industry cannot be trusted to police itself, period. We need cops on the beat in our banks, not just for the biggest Wall Street banks, but for banks that families entrust with their life savings and paychecks. Banks like SVB want to have it both ways. During boom times, they disparage anything to do with government and regulation. But as soon as things get rocky or go bust, they come crying to Uncle Sam for a bailout. We've seen it over and over. Not this time. President Biden made it clear this week, American taxpayers won't be bailing out SVB. The president also emphasized that our banking system is safe because of the actions regulators have taken. Americans should feel confident that their deposits will be there if they need them. But we can't stop there. We need to take action to prevent these financial meltdowns from happening in the first place. After the Great Recession in 2008, Congress passed the Dodd-Frank Act, the strongest bank regulation since the Great Depression. Oh, there were a lot of big banks whining and crying about too much government regulation, but we learned our lesson in the Great Recession and passed that bill in the House and Senate and signed into law. In 2018, the former president signed a law that rolled back critical parts of the bill, and I'm speaking, of course, of President Trump. He decided that Dodd-Frank went too far in his estimation, and he rolled back some of the protections. And dramatically, the Trump administration's initiative dramatically lowered capital and liquidity requirements for mid-sized banks just like SVB. In other words, then President Trump's regulatory rollback paved the way for the SVB collapse. That's why on Tuesday, I joined with my colleagues and the leadership of Senator Elizabeth Warren in introducing legislation to correct that mistake and restore critical Dodd-Frank protection. This is the least we can do to protect families and small businesses that trust banks with their money. Importantly, SVB wasn't the only bank that got in trouble this weekend. Two other banks, Silvergate Capital and Signature Bank, also failed. Silvergate and Signature were two of the most crypto-friendly institutions and did extensive business with the cryptocurrency industry, an industry that is rife with instability, fraud, and volatility. So the collapse of Silvergate and Signature is really just the latest example of the risk crypto poses to our economy. For months, I have been sounding the alarm on crypto. Yes, I am a crypto skeptic. The Senate Agriculture Committee, on which I serve, has held multiple hearings in recent months on cryptocurrency and proper regulation of the industry. At those hearings, I have warned about the contagion and risk if crypto was more fully integrated into the broader financial system. This weekend proved that those fears were not unfounded. The fears were confirmed by the failure of these two banks. This asset class, cryptocurrency, is unwieldy, unstable, unregulated, and we cannot allow it to spread risk across our financial system. Frankly, it's already gone too far. And now we need to be honest about crypto. It is a dangerous, risky investment that needs more transparency, more accountability, and strict regulation. The burden is on Congress to act. Madam President, I ask consent that the remarks I'm about to make be placed in a separate part in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. Behind the scenes of our nation's courtrooms and jail, you'll find some of our most dedicated public servants. They are America's public defense lawyers. They work long hours for low pay and even less attention and acclaim to protect the most American ideal, equal justice under the law. It's thanks to their service that every single citizen of this country is guaranteed the right to legal counsel. Well, this Saturday we have a chance to honor them. It's National Public Defender Day. And this year, National Public Defender Day also marks a major milestone in legal history. It's the 60th anniversary of the Supreme Court's decision in the landmark case Gideon versus Wainwright. Hard as it is to imagine, there were days before the Gideon decision when the constitutional right to legal counsel was not protected. That means in some states, if you were charged with a crime but couldn't afford a lawyer, you were on your own. That's exactly what happened to a man named Clarence Gideon in the summer of 1961. At the time, he was down on his luck, struggling with the disease of addiction on the streets of Panama City, Florida. Early one morning in June, he was arrested for a burglary. The evidence against him? A witness claimed that they saw him steal from a local pool hall. The police arrested him based on that accusation alone. When Mr. Gideon appeared in court, he told the judge he couldn't afford a lawyer and asked for an appointed attorney. The judge denied the request. He told Mr. Gideon that the court could only appoint a counsel to defendants facing the death penalty. In other words, Mr. Gideon was denied his Sixth Amendment right to counsel, which has been enshrined in our Constitution since the enactment of the Bill of Rights, because he wasn't accused of a very serious crime. Well, Mr. Gideon didn't need a law degree to know that something was wrong here. So he picked up a pen and a sheet of paper and wrote a letter to the United States Supreme Court. And with that letter, he changed history. The Supreme Court agreed to hear his case and finally appointed him an attorney, and not just an average attorney, future Supreme Court Justice Ex-POTUS. Fast forward to March of 1963, the court issued its decision. All 9 justices ruled unanimously in favor of Mr. Gideon. In the majority opinion, Justice Hugo Black said, "Lawyers in criminal courts are necessities, not luxuries." And he concluded, and I quote, that the noble ideal of fair trials before impartial tribunals in which every defendant stands equal before the law cannot be realized if the poor man charged with crime has to face his accusers without a lawyer to assist him. In the 6 decades since Gideon, generations of public defenders have stepped up to ensure that no one is denied their constitutional right to a legal counsel. And for our most vulnerable neighbors in particular, public defenders are an indispensable protection. They have protected the rights of low-income and indigent Americans. They've helped defendants access resources and services to get their lives back on track. And they've worked day in, day out to secure sentences that are humane and proportional. Moreover, public defenders provide a service to all of us by strengthening the integrity of our system of justice. Think about this. The United States has one of the highest rates of incarceration in the world. So when defendants are denied adequate legal representation, they can end up behind bars for crimes they did not commit or receive excessive, even inhumane sentences for those they did commit. That is a subversion of justice that wastes resources, violates fundamental values, and worst of all, treats humans as if they are disposable objects. So all of us owe a debt of gratitude to the public defenders fighting against these injustices. Madam President, I ask that the remainder of my remarks be placed in the record.
Without objection.
I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.